So, Nick Saban recently retired from the University of Alabama, the greatest coach to ever do it, the absolute greatest of them all, the GOAT, Roll Tide, Nick Saban. And now, Kalen DeBoer, who's recently been hired to replace Saban, has giant shoes to fill. He came from Washington, took Washington to the playoffs, had a very, very good season. Got to the championship against Michigan, ended up losing. Some Alabama fans, they're kind of on the fence. There's a few possible hires they could have gotten. Some candidates were Oregon's head coach Dan Lanning, then Norvell at Florida State, Sarkisian at Texas. I'm not sure if they actually got offered, but at the very least, they kind of got extensions and pay raises at their jobs to stay where they're at. So Alabama ended up with DeBoer. He also brought in some guys with him on the coaching staff. And, like I said, some guys are on the fence, but I think that's a really good hire. He's beaten, Dan Lanning multiple times. Now he's beaten Sark. He has a very good record against, the other candidates, and he's just winning right now. And I think they should be a little bit more optimistic. You're coming off a 14-1 season. I think, that's something to be excited about. No one's going to be Nick Saban. That's just the reality of it. But, good things are coming to Alabama, even though right now they got some issues with a major player exodus. But when you lose the greatest of all time, that's bound to happen. But I do think, we'll kind of see that level out a little bit. What do you think?
Yeah, whenever the news broke of Saban retiring, it kind of shocked me a little bit because I thought Nick Saban would come back another year and end out with a championship. It's kind of how everyone felt was he would end off on the right note, being national champion, and then right off in the sunset. Um, but um, he did retire, cap off to him, greatest of all time. His resume speaks for itself. We don't got to go into it. You guys know what it is. As far as DeBoer, I think it's a very good hire. No matter who Alabama's bringing in, it was going to be a great hire. Um, DeBoer is a very good coach. He's won it everywhere he was at. Um, so I think he's going to be really good for the program. Like you said, we're now Alabama fans got to understand that you're going to a new era where you don't have Nick Saban at the helm. So now, what does that mean? Well, you're probably not going to have the top three recruiting classes every year. I mean, you still might in a couple years, but right out of the gates, you're not going to have that. Um, Probably not going to win the SEC every year. So you just got to, Alabama fans got to adjust to this new era that they're going for. I think the board can do it. It's just there's mainly one factor that I question with him, and it's not the coaching. I think he can coach the players. He knows how to coach them. He's won football games. It's just can he win the recruiting battles? That's the big thing coming into going to the SEC at Alabama. That's what Nick Saban was able to do. He was able to win the recruiting battles to get the big time recruits to come to Tuscaloosa. Now you have to do that and step in for him. So that's the main big thing that I worry about is can you get those big time recruits and win the battles over Georgia, Ole Miss, who I think is going to be really good this year. Now you add in Oklahoma and Texas into the program, into the conference. I mean, which Texas and Oklahoma always gets big time recruits every year. So you got to battle them. Florida, there's still Florida's up and down, but they always somehow get a big time recruit or two from that area. Um, we'll see how A&M is. You're going into a bigger competition recruiting wise. If you say to Washington, he would have had a little bit of competition going into the Big Ten. Obviously, Penn State, Michigan, and Ohio State being the big three, and then also Oregon as well. But I think he's going to have a tougher time recruiting in Alabama. Um, you know, he I think I saw a stat where right after he left, Washington had like the 30 something best program. That you can't do that in the SEC. You got to have at least a top 15, top 10 recruiting class every year if you want to win the SEC and compete for a national title. Now they can still compete for a national title with this 12-team playoff, which is good for them because they could go lose 2 games, 3 games, and still sneak in the playoff with this 12-team playoff and the new selection thing, which we'll see how that goes. But that's just the main thing for me is can you win the recruiting battles against these big time teams that in large part have a bigger NIL than what you do right now. Because Alabama's NIL, it's good, but it's not a Georgia, it ain't a Texas. I mean, Isaiah Bond just flashed a Lamborghini. He left Bama, went to Texas, and he flashed a Lamborghini. So that's what you're competing with. That's just the way college football is going to be. But for him, that's the biggest challenge. Like I said, he's going to win games. He's going to get the players ready. He can coach football. It's just can you go and win those big time recruiting battles against these teams in the SEC?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head there. My biggest concern with his recruiting and keeping these guys is he's really been a West Coast guy this whole time. He was at Fresno State before going to Washington, so he doesn't really have too much experience in that territory. He doesn't really have, those connections and pipelines built up. And he doesn't have the same prestige and leverage that Saban has because if you're kind of on the fence about maybe going to Alabama or LSU or wherever, Nick Saban, you're playing for the greatest coach of all time. Like, if you go here, your chances of going to the pros and winning championships is elevated. And DeBoer just doesn't kind of have that leverage to really sway guys. And I do think that's a factor in a lot of these guys leaving. Obviously, they're being offered bukus of money to leave Alabama at the moment when they're kind of in a state of flux right now. And it does seem like he's struggling to keep a lot of these guys. And another thing I want to get into is the momentum because you need like a good first year to get these recruits and players. And if they're losing all these guys and they're going into a tough year in the SEC, they're going to be off to a rocky start this year, and they can't really go out and get too many guys right now either. Their team is like open for the taking, but these other schools really aren't at the moment. Besides, like Washington and Arizona, because their windows got opened again too for losing their coaches. So they're losing guys and they can't really replace them. So they could be looking at a really tough year one. It's a really tough schedule too. So the momentum shifts. It could be really rough waters for them there. So I think they are going to struggle year one. And, now they don't have the advantage that they quite used to have with Saban being there. So we'll see how that pans out. I do think, like you said, they need to get used to not being on the same level they have been. I kind of think at best they're probably going to be around the LSU type level where they're always, pretty good. They're always going to somewhat compete for the SEC and they might win a championship every few years like LSU does, but they're not going to be like the perennial dynasty that they have been in years past without Saban.
Yeah, I'm just gonna point out just some key players that they've lost so far. So they lost Cooley McKinstry, he's going to the pros. Their stud corner. Caleb Downs is going to Ohio State. He announced that last night. That's
Mm-hmm.
another big loss on the
For
defensive
sure.
side of the ball. Uh, just about an hour ago, Caden Proctor, who was the stud freshman O line for them, he was really good. He's going to Iowa. That's where he's from, and that's kind of where he's been picked up. Was crystal ball was to go to Iowa. I think I heard was going to go to Iowa or had plans of going to Iowa, then he switched to Bama. So he's basically going back home. Um, and then obviously Isaiah Bond. on the offensive side of the ball. That's a big loss. He's going to Texas. So those are just kind of the key guys from last year that, and there's more, but those are just the top ones I can think of on the top of my head that were the key guys from last year that you got to replace. And like you mentioned, their schedule is kind of difficult. I mean, your first two games are at home. You play Western Kentucky and South Florida. You should win those two games. Then you go to Wisconsin. Mhm. I mean, we got to see with Wisconsin, but you never know. Um, so we'll see. They were kind of iffy this year. I thought they would have been better this year than what they were,
Did
but you
beat
never know.
LSU in the bowl game, worth mentioning too.
Yeah. So that's a tricky one. I mean, you never know. It is a road game, so we'll see. You get Georgia at home, which is good, but I think Georgia's going to be the best team in the country. That's just my opinion. You go to Vandy, should win that. You get South Carolina at home, should win that. I mean, I think South Carolina's taken a big dip than what they were 2 years ago when they had that great season. Beat Tennessee at home and they had Hendon Hooker and everybody. So they've kind of dipped at that point. Get Missouri at home. That's a coin flip. Missouri's pretty good. They're losing their running back, but they got Luther Burden, who I think is going to be in the conversation for the best receiver in the country next year. You saw him do it as a freshman, and he's going to be pretty good. Their quarterback's pretty good too. So I think Missouri's going to be pretty good next year. So that's going to be a tough one. You go to LSU, rivalry game. It's hard to tell. I mean, rivalry games, anything can happen. Then you get Mercer at home, should win. Go to Oklahoma in late November, and then finish out the year with the Iron Bowl with Auburn at home. So it's not going to be an easy schedule. That's the schedule he has to deal with. Um, so it's going to be interesting. I can see them winning 8 to 9 games because you still have some of those teams from the SEC who are going to be lower than you talent wise, so you can beat them, but you still have to bring your A game. Especially at Tennessee and at LSU. I mean, we saw what happened at Neyland 2 years ago when Tennessee walked off. Probably one of the best games that we've seen in a long time. As far as like conference SEC games during the regular season, there's been good games and championship game stuff, but regular season wise, probably one of the better ones. But I mean, it's manageable to get 9 wins, 8 to 9 win games, but it's going to be hard for them to make the playoff because I think the SEC is just going to be too good. And um, yeah, you just got a lot of holes to fill going into this year. Now we'll see after spring ball, we'll see who all leaves because I think the portal opens up after spring ball. So we'll see from other teams who leaves if they can go out and get those transfers in the portal and bring them in to help replace those holes. Um, but yeah, they just have a lot of holes to fill. And but I think he'll get them right. It's just you got to give it a couple of years. Bama fans just got to slow it down, put their foot on the brakes, and give them a couple of years, and then they'll be okay.
Yeah, I do think, there's going to be a lot of growing pains. The biggest issue is that they have these holes to fill, that now all these guys are leaving. I do think they can kind of recoup a bit after spring ball, like you said, and kind of hope for the best. But you know, I I just think it's going to be quite a drop off for them year one. Just we don't know yet what this team's going to quite look like by the end, by the time the season comes around. But just thinking about them against some of these opponents that they're going to be playing, I'm struggling to see them picking up too many wins. I kind of feel like best case scenario is maybe 8 wins. That's a little harsh, but and there's still a lot of talented players on the roster. I think DeBoer's doing a really good job putting the coaching staff together. He's hired multiple FBS coaches to be position coaches now on the staff, which is kind of wild. And he also brought over the OC from Washington too. So I think it's a good staff. If they can recoup these guys and get some of these guys that they need to fill these holes, then they'll be better off than what I'm saying. But I do think it's going to be quite the drop off